At 909. 909 will be the song of invitation tonight. So I was reading some articles on the ChristianCourier.com, and I came across an article by Jason Jackson that said, Agape, a Christian husband's obligation. Oh, husband's obligation, that kind of caught my eye. So I started reading that, and I thought, well, this would be a good subject for a Devo. You know, it's a little longer than what I'm going to present tonight, so I just distilled it down to in a time that we could talk about it. Let's turn over to Ephesians 5:25, and we're going to read down to verse 32. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for it, that he might sanctify it, having cleansed it by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. Even so ought husbands also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his own wife loveth himself. For no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourished and cherished it, even as Christ also the church, because we are members of his body. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The mystery is great, but I speak in regard of Christ and of the church. So do you love your husbands? Do you love your wives like Christ loved the church? It turns out that's a commandment. So a husband, if he's living like God wants him to live, he will love his wife accordingly. As Christ as the example, we should be selfless, like Christ was selfless for giving himself upon the cross. Selfishly for her spiritual needs. And this love is agape love here. There's different types of love. There's phileo, like brotherly love. You know, there's romantic love. There's family love. There's different types of Greek words that define love. But this is agape. And if everybody lived agape love, the world would be a much better place. Because, you know, agape always puts the person's interest, best interest. Most people just, you know, they want to fight, argue, or whatever. But let's think about agape love. And God's love excludes no one. God wants everyone to be loved. But do they all accept it? Nope. You can read in Romans 2, 4 through 5, or Acts 13, 32 through 48. So Christians, the children of God, are called to agape their enemies and their brethren. That's a hard one, but that's a command. We need to love our enemies, but it's agape love. We should always be working in their best interest. Maybe spiritually, where they could be converted down the road by some action that we do. You just don't know. But you know, the first thing is you want to rip their heads off or whatever, but that's not agape love. So, let's see, where am I? So if Christians must love all people, surely Christian men should agape their wives. So Christian husbands are to love their wives as Christ also loved the church. Note, that's agape. Is one of, okay, I already said that. It's one of several words defined by the English word love. So God designed husbands and wives to be one, you know, leave and become one. That's a beautiful revelation there. And then when Paul wrote about the Christian home, in this chapter it talks about the kids later on, the parents and kid family dynamic, but we're only going to talk about the husbands and wives. But God's designed husbands and wives to be one. Okay, when Paul wrote about Christian love, he said, this mystery is great, but I speak regard of Christ and of the church, and in verse 32. So it's a good thing that he didn't get any deeper. He kept what do you call it? With contact within the church, and agape applies to the church love here. So the more we appreciate Christ and the church, the more we will understand how we ought to behave as Christian spouses. That's a good point. So Paul instructs husbands to consider Christ as a perfect model for agape love. Using agape as the acrostic, let us look at 5 truths that help us understand the husband's obligation. So we're going to look at agape, A-G-A-P-E. So A stands for attitudes and actions. That means that the husband must think and act like Christ. A does not stand for avoidance. Agape love is not sentimentality. I had to look this up. I go, sentimentality? That's a $25 college word. But when I looked up Merriam's definition, it says, the quality of being strongly influenced by happy memories of past events or relationships with other people, rather than by careful thought and judgment based on facts. So when you meet people and you got to look at the facts. Don't think about good times or happy times. Think about how you apply the love based with the facts that you see. Agape love is defined as the husband's love for his wife's soul. Like Christ, who loved and therefore gave, a Christian husband should be selfless in his attitudes and actions. So that's A, attitudes and actions. The next letter in agape is G. G stands for goal-driven. This is an eternal reason for a Christian's husband's attitude and actions. It is a reason for which Christ endured the cross, according to Hebrews 12:2. Consider the results that Christ sought for the church. He loved the church, so he gave himself for it that he might sanctify it. 2, present it. 3, that he should be holy and without blemish. And that's Ephesians 5:25-27 that we read. Husbands should have the same kind of goals in their purpose. Husbands should facilitate their wives' spiritual growth. Corresponding to Christ's example, they should contribute to their wives. Number 1, being set apart and serving others in the Lord. That's the same as sanctify. Sanctify means set apart. Number 2, being faithful in all things so that their wives will be presented as a part of the church. And number 3, being vigilant to be holy and without blemish. The Christian wife ought to be growing with her husband's help, not in spite of his hindrance. The Christian husband must make his home into a spiritual harbor within heaven is the goal. Okay, so A stands for attitude and action. G stands for goal-driven. Now we're on A again. G-A-G-A. Stands for always. By its nature, agape does not wax or wane. Love never fails. You can read about love in 1 Corinthians 13-8. It talks about all the different aspects of love. In other words, love is not going to be superseded by something better. It must remain as a permanent commitment to the one loved. Romans 5:8. Christ loved us so much he died for us. So therefore, the husband should always be slow to become resentful. That's a hard one. He must react with good when ill-treated. He should never envy her. He ought to realize his inability to give enough and not report on how much he has given, always. That's a hard one to swallow. So, I'm talking to myself here too. That one hit me. He does not file faults or fly off the handle because agape is not overwhelmed. Sometimes we get overwhelmed, and I may have flown off the handle a few times. I'm sad to say, but that wasn't agape love. So A is attitudes and action. G is goal-driven. A is always. P stands for principled conduct. This point also makes agape distinctive and divine. It means that the husband is called to love because God commands it. Note, Paul uses the imperative mood to command the husband to agape according to Christ's example. And then verse 25 we read, this love can be learned. So agape, family love is, you're just attracted to your family, you're romantic. Those are just natural, but agape love, you have to learn agape love. It's not as natural. So, but it can be learned. And couples can conform to God's will and Christ's pattern. A husband can agape his wife even when he is not loved in return. It is not a proper consideration to ask, does she really deserve it? We did not earn Christ's love. He loved us first, 1 John 4:19. The Christian husband will initiate a concern for his wife's spirituality out of principle, as Christ also loved the church. So A is attitude and action, G is goal-driven, A is always, and P stands for principled conduct. And the last letter in this acrostic word is E, stands for elevating benefits. Agape enhances the self-image of the one loved. Principle, goal-driven love can help a spouse through times of significant anxiety. Agape can provide stability and emotional security. Divine love makes every day better, breaking down walls of defensiveness and quarreling. A husband living like God wants him to live will love his wife like Christ loved the church, giving himself selflessly for her spiritual needs. That is agape, a Christian husband's eternal rewarding obligation. So that's my presentation tonight. I hope that was beneficial. It was beneficial for me. So if there's anybody in the audience that needs to respond to the invitation, we ask that you come as we stand and sing. That's E.G.